Alright, let's talk about feature creep. It's something you might have heard of before. So I'm going to define feature creep as similar to shovelware, where you have software that has a scope. So somebody that watches this video will see where this is going. But you have a project that needs to do a specific thing, a set of things, and people will start sending in patches. This is where this image comes from. I'm going to talk about Wayland and Xorg in a bit, but basically, you have software that needs to fulfill your set of goals. And so what'll happen is you'll start getting patches from people that don't really align with your project's goals. So a quick example of this is there was a app for Android used to post on 4chan or to browse 4chan. I think it was Clover or Kuroba, one of those two. And people started sending in patches for the features they wanted. And of course, the developer would reject those patches because it was something like, "Oh, I want to have a image editor built into the app or something crazy like that that should be done in a external app." You can consider this. It's not Unix philosophy, so people would think, oh, well, that means that feature creep is something that violates the Unix philosophy, and it does, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that. What it does mean is that your app can do as many things as you want. Like there can still be feature creep in systemd, you know, or whatever software you can think of, you can turn it into feature creep. But the reason I brought this up is because somebody had commented. I put this video out yesterday or the day before that that I recommended Mint, and the main reason is because it was one of the distros that was staying on Xorg for now. Eventually, it'll probably move to Wayland, but I'm hoping that Wayland will be more usable for like most everybody by then. It's kind of a blind hope, honestly. But when I said that, I said, Wayland has trouble working on this older hardware that I have, and I'm having trouble getting it to work correctly on other people's old hardware. They're having issues with sleep, they're having issues with waking, they're having issues with loss of display, that kind of thing. And so somebody said, talk is cheap, send patches. Now, that's kind of a misunderstanding of what that means. What talk is cheap, send patches means is if I were bitching about Hyperlin having security issues, I should be patching those security issues. It's something that's within the scope of the project. It's something that VexFree should care about. Um, and so you can send in a patch that works with this program to fix whatever issue you have with it. Wayland and Xorg are not two programs where that argument works, and so to talk about that, we have to go through a slight bit of history. Is Xorg built in the 70s or 80s, I can't remember which, and it's a literal display server, as in you're supposed to be connected to a from like fiber optic cable over like between floors of your office from like a VAX 17 to a 68K workstation or something. So Xorg has developed kind of from that point, and there's a lot of hacks going on. And so around 2008, people were like, "Oh, we can fix Xorg, but we can't just fork Xorg. We have to actually redesign everything from the ground up because it has to follow our design principles." And that's what became Wayland. So now, of course, the opposite is happening, where people now have issues with Wayland's design philosophy. But the thing is, when you so my complaint wasn't about problems with Wayland that can be addressed, basically, because older hardware is not in the scope of the project. They want to target new hardware. Obviously, the new software is going to work with the new hardware. You know, that's just kind of the way it goes. And you can look at Ex Libra as an example of why it's hard to just send the patches, because eventually somebody's going to sabotage you and you're going to have to fork it, or you're going to have to do a hostile fork of some sort. And so what you end up with is you have multiple forks of software. The main organization refuses your patches. Nobody adopts your patches. So there's a lot of fighting going on within that community, but in the same way you can't just fork Xorg. They did and turned it into Ex Libra. It doesn't change the core philosophy of what Xorg was. With Wayland, the things that I complain about are basically, instead of sending a patch, I would be sending a, hey, you need to support older hardware, basically. I've gotten it to work on some machines. It's very iffy depending on the distro, which ones work with what. But uh, I wanted to talk a bit about feature creep because when there is a right time to say talk is cheap, send patches, and Imolo was one of those that used it correctly most of the time, where I had an actual bug and it's like, okay, send a patch for the bug. I can't really patch Wayland this way. It's the response I would get if I were to send, like, if I actually went through the effort of learning like low level development and writing all these graphics drivers or whatever I needed to do. What would end up happening is the Wayland devs would say, "Oh, well, we're kind of trying to, do things the right way, not necessarily the fast way. So we're gonna have to hold off on this and figure out how to implement it later, basically. I'm not going to become like a Wayland developer for what I'm saying. So kind of, I wanted to turn that into kind of a teachable moment because people do want to throw that around, like basically the argument is if you don't like it, program it yourself. And it's like, yeah, you can kind of say that, but honestly, not everybody's a programmer. Some people just have to deal with the operating system they're given. They have to deal with their graphic stack, and you can listen all day, every day about people complaining about Wayland. I use Xorg on some machines. I use Wayland on others. I use what works on what machine. I need it for. So it's not like I don't not like Wayland or anything. It's just that when the thing that I meant about that was when somebody is asking me for a generic recommendation, am I going to give them Wayland or Xorg? And I would like to give them Wayland, but I can't guarantee it. I can't guarantee that it's going to work on their hardware, and I may start throwing that as the initial suggestion as time goes on, especially for people with newer computers. But it's just going to kind of depend. But I made this little infographic to kind of poke fun of the situation a bit, but yeah, that's kind of where I'm at though. Is think when you're thinking about the scope of a project, you can complain about things that the project doesn't do that without fear of, pretty much without fear of repercussion of somebody saying, well, why don't you just patch it? And it's like, well, because the thing that I'm complaining about is more a design issue. It's a core issue of the program. It's not something that they are going to change because it's not something that they want to change, you know? So you can just say, oh, they would just reject my patch even if I did that, you know? So, anyways, that's just a little short one I wanted to talk about today is think about feature creep, think about what your project does and what it doesn't do, you know? And, obviously use what works best for what you're trying to do. All right, thanks, bye.